I have signed my name to thousands of documents that ended other people's marriages, other people's houses, other people's lives as they knew them. Deeds of trust, quitclaim deeds, divorce settlements dividing a home down to the square foot. 22 years as a title examiner teaches you something most people never learn until it's too late. A house doesn't care who loves who inside it. A house only cares what the paper says. So when I turned onto Cardigan Lane on the worst night of my life, 3 hours after I had watched my sister's casket lowered into red Georgia clay, and saw an unfamiliar white Kia parked crooked in my driveway, I did not scream. I did not run inside and start throwing plates. I stood in the yard I had planted myself, azaleas on the left, hydrangeas on the right, and I did the thing 22 years of reading fine print had trained into my hands before it ever reached my heart. I took out my phone, and I started documenting. That single decision, calm, cold, procedural, is the reason that 6 months later, when my husband sat across from me at our kitchen table and slid a folder toward me and said the words, "I just need you to sign this," I already knew exactly what was inside it, exactly what he was trying to take from me, and exactly how it was going to end. It did not end the way he thought it would. My name is Margaret Coulson. Everyone calls me Meg, except my husband Daniel, who has called me Margaret since the night he proposed, because he said Meg sounded like a name for someone's dog, and Margaret sounded like a name for someone's wife. I laughed at the time. 23 years old, sitting on a tailgate in Daniel's parents' backyard, string lights overhead, and I thought that was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. I am 51 years old now. I have worked as a title examiner for the same regional firm outside Macon, Georgia, since I was 29, tracing chains of ownership back through decades of deeds, hunting for the one missing signature, the one unresolved lien, the one small omission that could unravel an entire sale. My coworkers call me the bloodhound. I have a gift, apparently, for noticing the thing that isn't there. I did not notice the thing that wasn't there in my own marriage, not for a long time. Before I tell you what happened in that driveway, I want you to understand what I thought my life was, because the size of what I lost only makes sense if you understand the size of what I believed I had. Daniel and I married young. I was 24, he was 26, in a Baptist church his mother chose, in a dress my mother altered by hand because we couldn't afford the seamstress the bridal shop recommended. We bought the house on Cardigan Lane 4 years later, a modest brick ranch with a carport and a pecan tree in the back that dropped nuts all over the yard every October. And I remember standing in the empty living room the day we closed, sunlight coming through windows that had no curtains yet, thinking that this was the room where the rest of my life was going to happen. I was not wrong about that. I was only wrong about what kind of life it would turn out to be. We tried for children for 6 years, and it never happened. A private grief Daniel and I handled in almost opposite ways. He stopped talking about it entirely, threw himself into work at the dealership, started coaching a rec league softball team for other people's kids on Saturday mornings. I filled the space with my career, with Ellen's visits, with a garden that grew more elaborate every year I didn't have a nursery to plan instead. I tell you this not because it excuses anything that came later, but because I want you to understand that our marriage was not, in my mind, a hollow thing waiting to be filled by someone else. It was a life two people had built out of substitutions and quiet compromises, the way most long marriages are built. And I believed, right up until the day of my sister's funeral, that we were building it together. I had dreams that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. And I think that matters too. I wanted, someday, to open a small consulting practice, helping first-time homebuyers understand exactly what they were signing, the kind of plain language guidance nobody gives people when they're 26 years old and terrified and handed 400 pages at a closing table. I had a notebook full of ideas for it, tucked in my nightstand, that I hadn't shown anyone but Ellen. I was afraid, in the ordinary way most women my age are afraid, of being unnecessary. To my job eventually, to my husband, to a house that had never once heard a child's footsteps running down its hallway. I did not know that the thing I should have been afraid of wasn't irrelevance. It was betrayal, moving quietly through the house while I sat at my sister's bedside, believing I was only losing one person that summer instead of two. My sister Ellen was 18 months younger than me, and the only person on earth who had known me before I became somebody's wife. She got the diagnosis in March, pancreatic, stage 4, the kind of cancer that doesn't wait for you to get your affairs in order. I spent 4 months driving 2 hours each way to sit with her during chemo, to hold the little plastic basin when she got sick, to read her the same 3 chapters of the same paperback because it was the only thing that let her sleep. Daniel came exactly twice. He said hospitals made him feel helpless. I told myself that was an honest thing for a man to admit. Ellen died on a Tuesday in July. I was holding her hand. The funeral was that Saturday, at the little Methodist church in Perry where we'd both been baptized, where our mother had been buried 9 years earlier and our father 4 years before that. Ellen had no children, no husband, just me, a handful of cousins, and 40 years of neighbors who remembered her as a little girl running barefoot through the sprinkler in our parents' yard. I gave the eulogy. My voice did not break until the very last line, and I have replayed that moment 1,000 times since, wondering if some part of me already sensed that grief was about to become the least of what that day would cost me. Daniel sat in the second pew. He held my hand during the service. He told me, at the graveside, that he loved me, that he was proud of how strong I was being, that he'd have dinner waiting when I got home. I remember thinking, in the raw, hollowed-out way you think things on the day you bury the last person who remembers your childhood, that I was lucky, that whatever else was wrong in the world, I still had a husband who showed up. He left the cemetery before I did, said he wanted to beat the traffic on the highway, get things ready for me. I stayed another 20 minutes, standing over 2 graves that were now 3 feet apart from where Ellen's would be dug in the following weeks. And I did not know yet that getting things ready meant something entirely different than what I imagined. I drove home alone, in my black dress, mascara ruined, exhausted in a way that lived somewhere below my bones. And when I turned onto Cardigan Lane, I saw the white Kia in my driveway, parked at an angle that told me whoever drove it had never backed into that space before. I did not know the car. I knew, immediately, in the specific silence that falls over a person right before they understand something they will spend the rest of their life wishing they didn't, that I was about to. I want to tell you what 22 years in title work does to a person's instincts, because it matters for everything that comes after. When you spend 2 decades reading the fine print other people never bother to read, searching courthouse records for the lien nobody disclosed, the easement nobody mentioned, the ex-spouse who never actually signed off on the sale, you develop a particular kind of patience. You learn that the worst news usually doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone thorough enough to find it. You learn to feel the shape of a problem before you have proof of it, the way a doctor can tell something is wrong from a patient's color before the test results come back. So I sat in my car in front of my own house for 4 full minutes, engine running, air conditioning blowing on a face that had cried more in 4 days than in the previous 4 years combined. And I cataloged what I was looking at instead of walking inside and demanding an explanation. The Kia had a parking permit sticker from Wesleyan College in the back window. There was a stack of moving boxes visible through the rear windshield, the flattened kind you buy from a U-Haul store, not the kind you save from your last move. There was a potted plant, a peace lily, ironic in a way I wouldn't appreciate until later, wedged between 2 boxes. Someone was moving in, not visiting, moving in. I could have walked through that front door and screamed. Some part of me, the part that was still 23 years old on a tailgate, still believed the man who called her Margaret because it sounded like a wife's name, wanted to. But another part of me, the part that had spent that morning watching her sister's casket disappear into the ground, was simply too tired to give Daniel the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in real time. And a third part of me, the quiet, professional part that had made a career out of not missing things, understood something crucial before I ever opened the car door. Whatever this was, I was going to need proof of exactly how it started. Not proof for a courtroom, not yet, proof for myself. Because I already knew, with the flat, sick certainty of someone who has read 1,000 contracts, that a man capable of doing this on the day of my sister's funeral was a man capable of lying to my face about when it began. I opened my phone. I photographed the license plate. I photographed the boxes. Through the window. I noted the time, 4:52 p.m., and I sent myself an email with the subject line, Cardigan Lane, 7/19 inches, because email, unlike a text message, timestamps itself on a server I don't control and can't quietly edit later. Then I walked inside my own house, still wearing my sister's funeral clothes, and I met the woman who had been living in it, apparently, since sometime that morning. Her name was Brooke Sinclair. She was 29 years old, 22 years younger than me, 1 year older than my nephew would have been if my brother had lived to have children, a detail that meant nothing to anyone but me, and that I noted anyway, the way you note things when your mind is grasping for anything solid. She was standing in my kitchen, unpacking a box of dishes that were not mine into a cabinet that was. She looked up when I came in. I will give her this. She had the decency to look afraid. Daniel came around the corner from the hallway, holding a lamp I did not recognize, and for 1 full second, his face did something I had never seen it do in 26 years of marriage. It went completely blank, like a man watching a wall collapse in slow motion and calculating, in real time, whether he had enough seconds left to get out of the way. "Margaret," he said, "you're back early." I looked at the clock on the stove. It was 5:04 p.m. My sister's funeral had ended at 1:30. "I stopped by the cemetery a while," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I have thought about that steadiness a great deal since, whether it was strength or whether it was simply shock wearing strength's clothing. I still don't fully know. "Who is this?" "This is Brooke," Daniel said. And then, because apparently there is no bottom to what a frightened man will say when he's caught, he added, "She's a friend. She's between places. I told her she could stay here for a bit." Brooke did not correct him. I noted that too. I could have asked the obvious question. How does a friend between places arrive with a peace lily and a full set of dishes and start unpacking cabinets on the exact day you bury your only sister? I could have asked how long a friend had been receiving mail here, because I would later find out the answer was 6 weeks, forwarded to a P.O. box Daniel had opened in April without telling me. I could have asked whether Brooke knew that the sheets currently folded over her arm belonged to a woman who was, at that moment, still wearing black stockings with a run in them from kneeling at a graveside. I asked none of it. I said, "I need to change out of these clothes," and I walked past both of them, into a bedroom that no longer felt entirely mine, and I closed the door. People who have never lived through something like this always ask me the same question when I finally told this story years later. "Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you throw her out on the spot?" And I understand the question. I understand it's the response the moment seemed to demand. But I had spent that entire day watching a body I loved disappear into the ground, and some deep, tired, protective part of my brain had made a decision on my behalf before I ever walked through that door. I was not going to hand Daniel Coulson the version of this story where his wife had a hysterical breakdown on the worst day of her life. I was not going to give him a scene to describe later, to a lawyer, to friends, to Brooke herself, where I was the unstable one and he was the calm one managing a difficult situation. I was going to be the one thing he never expected. I was going to be quiet, and I was going to be exact. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my dress, and I opened the notes app on my phone, and I began writing down everything, in order, with times attached. It is a habit that would, 6 months later, save nearly everything I had. I did not leave that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think a lot of women who hear this story will recognize the calculation, even if they've never had to make it themselves. I was 51 years old. My sister, the only person who might have told me to pack a bag and go stay with her, had been buried that afternoon. My parents were gone. I had a mortgage with Daniel's name on it and mine, a retirement account we'd built together for 26 years, a job 2 hours from anywhere I might have run to, and, if I am honest, a very specific fear that leaving in a blaze of righteous fury would cost me more than staying calm and gathering information ever could. I did not yet know what Daniel had done to our finances. I only knew, with the certainty of someone who reads the fine print for a living, that a man capable of moving another woman into the family home on the day of a funeral was a man who had already made decisions about our future that I had not been consulted on, and I intended to find out exactly what those decisions were before I made a single move of my own. So I stayed. Brooke did not. That first night, after a conversation so quiet and so clipped it barely qualified as an argument, Daniel drove Brooke to a Hampton Inn off the interstate. He came home at 11:40 and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I hadn't touched, and he tried, for nearly an hour, to explain. The explanation shifted 3 times, which I noted. First, Brooke was a coworker from the dealership where he managed the service department, going through a bad breakup, and he'd offered his sofa out of simple kindness. Then, when I pointed out that coworkers going through breakups do not receive mail at a house for 6 weeks, the story became that they'd started seeing each other in the spring, that it wasn't serious, that he'd panicked when Brooke's lease fell through and made a mistake in judgment moving her in temporarily, while I was away. Finally, close to midnight, worn down by his own inconsistencies, he told me the truth, or something close enough to it that I could work with. He had been involved with Brooke Sinclair since February. He loved me, he said. He also loved her. He did not know what he wanted. He was sorry, desperately, tearfully sorry, that I had come home to it on the day I did. Though he was notably less sorry, I noticed, about the fact of it happening at all. I did not cry in front of him that night. I told him I needed time to think, and I went to sleep in the guest room, and I lay awake until nearly 4 a.m. turning over one central cold fact. A man does not accidentally move a girlfriend into a marital home. He plans it. He arranges the U-Haul boxes, and the change of mailing address, and the 6 weeks of quiet groundwork. And a man who plans something that carefully, while his wife is at her sister's deathbed, is a man who is planning other things too. Over the following days, Daniel and I reached what he called an arrangement, and what I privately called reconnaissance. Brooke would not move back in, that much I insisted on, and to my genuine surprise, he agreed without much fight, which told me something in itself. A man fighting for a relationship fights harder than that. He would see her outside the house. We would work on things. I let him believe I was doing the work of forgiveness. What I was actually doing, every evening after he fell, asleep, was going through 6 months of bank statements, credit card records, and the county property records I had access to through my job, looking for the answer to the only question that mattered to me now. What, exactly, was Daniel Coulson planning to do with the house, the accounts, and the life we had built, and how far along had he already gotten? I found the first irregularity 9 days after the funeral, and it had nothing to do with Brooke Sinclair at all. In 2019, Daniel had refinanced our home. A decision he told me at the time was purely about lowering our interest rate. What he had not told me, and what I found only because I pulled the actual recorded deed of trust through the county system I use every working day of my life, was that the refinance had also added a home equity line of credit against the property, one he had drawn against steadily over the following 3 years. $41,000, gone in increments of $2,000 and $3,000 at a time, none of it visible in our joint checking account. All of it funneled through a separate account at a bank we did not use, opened in his name only in 2019. The same year, I would later realize that the refinance closed. I sat with that number for a long time. $41,000 is not a number that disappears into nothing. It goes somewhere. I started looking for where. Some of it, I found, had gone to Brooke Sinclair directly, not in obvious lump sums, but in a pattern I recognized instantly from 22 years of reading financial records for a living. Regular transfers just under the threshold that triggers extra bank scrutiny. Time to land a few days after Daniel's own paycheck cleared, dressed up in memo lines that said things like loan repayment and consulting. Brooke, it turned out, did freelance social media work for the dealership where Daniel worked. Convenient, deniable. I am 51 years old, and I have read enough fraudulent invoices in my career to recognize a paper trail built to survive a casual glance and collapse under a careful one. But the money to Brooke was not the part that frightened me. The part that frightened me was smaller, and it took me 3 more weeks to find. Buried in a stack of mail Daniel had started collecting at the P.O. box he thought I didn't know about, which I discovered because I followed him there one Saturday morning, under the thin pretense of a hair appointment. It was a letter from a real estate attorney in Macon. Not our attorney, a new one, requesting a current appraisal on the property at 114 Cardigan Lane, and referencing, in language so carefully neutral, it might as well have been a confession, the client's stated intention to refinance the marital residence as sole owner pending resolution of joint tenancy. I read that sentence 4 times in the front seat of my car in a hair salon parking lot before I fully understood what it meant. Our house. The house I had lived in for 22 years. The house whose mortgage I had paid half of every single month. The house whose deed listed both our names as joint tenants with right of survivorship was being quietly appraised so that Daniel could remove my name from it. And the only way he could legally do that, the only way any of it would hold up, was if I signed something first. I want to be clear about what the next 4 months of my life looked like, because there was nothing dramatic about them, and that was entirely the point. I went to work. I examined titles for other people's houses while quietly building a file on my own. I came home every evening and cooked dinner for a man I now understood, with total clarity, was trying to take my house out from under me, while telling me, over that same dinner table, that he was working on us. I let him believe the marriage counseling appointment he suggested, one appointment, which he then quietly stopped attending, blaming his work schedule, represented genuine effort. I nodded when he said things were getting better between us. I said nothing when I found, tucked in his glove compartment during an oil change I offered to schedule for him, a receipt for a storage unit rented in September, 3 towns over, paid for 6 months in advance. Every one of those discoveries went into a folder, not a metaphorical folder, an actual one, a plain manila folder I kept at the bottom of a filing cabinet in my office at work, in a drawer that held nothing else remotely interesting, behind case files for 2 closings that had fallen through the year before. I photographed bank statements. I made copies of the P.O. box paperwork. I pulled certified copies of the deed of trust and the HELOC filing from the county recorder's office, using my own professional access, on my own initiative, for what I told my supervisor, truthfully, if not completely, was a personal matter involving my own property. I requested a copy of my own credit report and found, to my genuine relief, that Daniel had not yet attempted to open anything in my name. Whatever he was planning, he needed my signature for it, not my identity. There were nights I nearly broke. I want you to understand that, because a woman who does not cry in front of her husband is not a woman who does not cry at all. I cried in my Maitba car in the parking lot at work. I cried in the shower, where the water covers the sound. I cried once, badly, in a bathroom stall at a colleague's retirement party, after Daniel texted to say he'd be late again, a phrase that by October I understood as a kind of code I had learned to translate without effort. Grief for my sister and grief for my marriage had started to braid together into something I didn't have a name for, a specific, exhausting kind of mourning for 2 people who were still, technically, alive. But every time I felt the ground shifting under me, I went back to that manila folder, and I reminded myself of the one thing 22 years of title work had taught me better than anything else. The truth does not need you to be loud. It only needs you to be thorough. Daniel was building a story he intended to tell a judge, a lawyer, maybe even Brooke, about a marriage that had quietly ended long before any paperwork made it official. I was building the story he had actually lived, the dates, the transfers, the storage unit, the P.O. box, the appraisal request filed 9 days after my sister's funeral. And I intended for that story to be the only one that survived contact with a courtroom. By December, I had a name for what I was doing, even if I never said it out loud. I was not staying in my marriage. I was staying in my house, gathering evidence, until my husband made the mistake I already knew he was going to make. I drove to the storage facility on a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray, wet Georgia afternoon that makes everything feel like it's happening underwater. I had told the office I had a dentist appointment. I had told Daniel nothing at all. The facility manager, a heavy-set man named Curtis with a country radio station playing low behind the front desk, was more helpful than he should have been, mostly because I did something I am not proud of and would do again without hesitation. I told him I was Daniel Colson's wife, that we shared the unit, that I'd misplaced my access code and needed to confirm the unit number for a delivery. It was not, strictly, a lie. I was his wife. The unit, as it turned out, absolutely was shared property under Georgia law, whether Daniel had intended it to be or not, because he had paid for it from a joint line of credit secured against our jointly owned home, a fact I would use 6 weeks later to considerable effect. Curtis walked me to Unit 214. I did not have a key. I did not need one. Not yet. What I needed was simply to know it existed, to photograph the exterior, to log the date on the rental agreement Curtis was kind enough to let me glance at, just to confirm the account, which listed a start date of September the 9th and a monthly rate of $90, auto-paid from an account ending in 4471, which I recognized instantly as the same account that had received Daniel's HELOC draws for 3 years running. I stood outside that gray metal door for a long moment, in the rain, and I understood something with total clarity. Whatever Daniel Coulson was moving out of our house, piece by piece into a unit 90 minutes away, he was doing it slowly enough and quietly enough that he believed I would never notice until it was finished. He was wrong. I had noticed nearly all of it. What I hadn't yet found was the piece that would make everything else make sense. The reason, the actual, specific, financial reason that a man would risk his marriage, his reputation, and a fairly serious amount of money on a woman half his age. I found it 3 weeks later, and it had nothing to do with love at all. Brooke Sinclair, it turned out, was not simply a coworker at the dealership. She was the daughter of the dealership's regional owner, a man named Curtis Sinclair, no relation to the storage facility Curtis. A coincidence that struck me as almost cruelly funny at the time. Daniel had been passed over for a general manager promotion 18 months earlier, a decision he'd raged about at our dinner table for a week and then never mentioned again, which I now understood was not resignation, but redirection. A relationship with the owner's daughter, followed by a marriage, followed by a divorce from his current wife that left him with the marital home free and clear to sell or refinance as he saw fit, was not a romance. It was, in the plainest terms I can put it, a business plan. And the storage unit, the P.O. box, the HELOC, draws, the appraisal request. Every piece of it was Daniel quietly extracting whatever equity and assets he could from a 26-year marriage before that marriage's ending became official enough for a lawyer to start asking questions about where the money went. I drove home from that storage facility with the manila folder now 4 inches thick, and for the first time since the day of Ellen's funeral, I did not cry. I felt something closer to what I imagine a title examiner feels the moment before she finds the lien that kills the whole deal. Not triumph, exactly. Certainty. I came close to losing all of it on a Thursday in December, and I think about that night more than almost any other, because it is the night that taught me how thin the line really was between the composed woman I was trying to be and the frightened one I actually was underneath it. Daniel came home early. I did not hear the garage door because I had my earbuds in, sitting at the kitchen table with the manila folder spread open in front of me, cross-referencing HELOC draw dates against a printed bank statement, a highlighter in my hand, and 3 years of financial records fanned out across the surface, where we used to eat dinner as a couple. By the time I registered his footsteps in the hallway, he was already in the doorway, and there was nothing on that table that could plausibly have been mistaken for anything but exactly what it was. I did not panic. I want to tell you that as though it were simple, but my hands were shaking so badly under the table that I had to press them, flat against my thighs, to stop the tremor from reaching my voice. What saved me in that moment was not courage. It was 22 years of habit, the reflexive, practiced calm of a woman who has spent her entire career delivering bad news to strangers across a closing table without ever raising her voice. Because raising your voice in that job means the deal falls apart and somebody's family doesn't get their house. "What is all this?" Daniel said. He wasn't asking. He already suspected. "Insurance paperwork," I told him. And then, because a half-truth told with total confidence is stronger than a lie told with hesitation, I added, "The agent wants updated records before he'll renew the homeowner's policy. Something about the claims environment this year. I've been putting it off for weeks." It was, in its way, not entirely false. I had in fact called our insurance agent 2 days earlier, though not for the reason I gave Daniel, and I had a genuine renewal notice sitting in the mail pile by the door that I deliberately left visible weeks earlier, without fully understanding at the time that some instinct in me was already building a cover story before I consciously knew I'd need one. Daniel looked at the papers for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. Then he looked at me, really looked, the way you look at someone when part of you wants to believe them, and another part of you is doing math you don't want to finish, and something in my face must have held, because he exhaled, said something about how he hated dealing with insurance too, and went to change out of his work clothes. I sat at that table for another 10 minutes after he left the room, not moving, listening to my own pulse in my ears, and I understood two things with total clarity. The first was that I was not as far along as I needed to be. That if he had come home 20 minutes earlier, before I'd have had time to build any explanation at all, 6 months of careful, quiet work could have collapsed in a single doorway. The second was that Daniel, whatever else he was not stupid, and a man that close to finalizing a plan of his own does not stay unsuspicious forever. I realized, perhaps 6 weeks before his own timeline forced his hand, the appraisal was already back, the new attorney already retained. Whatever I was going to do with what I'd found, I needed to be ready before he was. I moved the folder out of the house the next morning, into a locked drawer at my office, behind the same forgotten closing files as before, and I did not bring a single page of it home again. I had come within one bad-timed doorway of losing everything I'd spent 6 months building, and I was not going to make that mistake twice. Some victories in this story are quiet, procedural, almost invisible from the outside. That Thursday night was one of them, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I sat across from the man who was planning to take my house out from under me. And for the first time, I did not blink first. Daniel asked me to sign the papers on a Sunday evening in late January, 6 months almost to the day since I'd driven home from my sister's funeral to find a peace lily in my driveway. He'd been building up to it for a week, softer than usual, more attentive, the way a man gets right before he needs something. He made dinner, which he had not done in years. He opened a bottle of the wine we used to drink on our anniversary. And when the plates were cleared, he set a manila folder of his own on the kitchen table, considerably thinner than mine, and slid it toward me with a gentleness that, 6 months earlier, might have broken my heart all over again. "I need you to sign this," he said. "It's just a refinance, Margaret. Nothing changes for you. It just puts things in order." Inside the folder was a quitclaim deed, transferring my interest in 114 Cardigan Lane to Daniel as sole owner, paired with a refinance application that would pull an additional $62,000 in equity, on top of the $41,000 already gone, releasing it, per the accompanying loan documents, entirely into an account in Daniel's name alone. There was also, tucked at the back, a handwritten note in Daniel's own writing that I don't think he meant to leave in there at all, a set of numbers under the heading B, Dealership Buy-in, which told me, more plainly than anything else, in that folder, exactly where the money was going and exactly how much of my life Daniel had already spent, on paper, before he ever asked my permission. I looked at that folder for a long time, long enough that Daniel started talking again, filling the silence the way people do when they've mistaken your calm for confusion instead of what it actually was. 22 years of training finally meeting its moment. "Margaret, it's just paperwork," he said. "You don't even have to think about it. I've already talked to a title company. They can close by the end of the month." "Which title company?" I asked. It was the first thing I'd said since opening the folder. He named one. I knew the closing attorney there personally. We'd worked opposite sides of a dozen transactions over the years. "Good," I said. "Then you'll understand when I tell you I'm not signing this, and you'll understand why." I opened my own folder then, the real one, the 4-inch one, the one I had built alone, in the quiet hours after he'd fallen asleep, believing I still trusted him. I laid it out piece by piece, the way I would for any client whose closing had a fatal defect buried in the chain of title. The hillock draws, the P.O. box opened in April, 6 weeks before I ever found Brooke's boxes in our kitchen. Proof, in his own handwriting on the change of address form, that the affair and the planning long predated the day I'd been told was simply an unfortunate coincidence. The transfers to Brooke dressed up as consulting fees. The storage unit, paid from our joint credit line, its contents, which I had finally viewed 10 days earlier, after Curtis let me in under the same not quite a lie as before, containing not spare furniture but the good silver 3 of my late mother's paintings, and a fire safe I did not yet have the combination to, but which I had already photographed, catalogued, and reported, calmly, to our insurance company as missing scheduled property. And finally, the note about the dealership buy-in, which I set directly on top of the pile, facing him. "You've spent 6 months moving our money and half our house into your name and Brooke's future," I said. "You did the first part of it on the day I buried my sister. I have every transfer, every date, and a sworn appraisal request filed 9 days after her funeral. If you take this folder to any attorney in this county, Daniel, they are going to tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. You don't have a wife who's going to quietly sign away her equity to make your new life easier. You have a title examiner who has spent 6 months building the file that ends yours. He didn't reach for the papers. His hand stayed flat on the table, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The wine going warm in 2 glasses neither of us had touched since dinner. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the softness he'd walked in with. "You've been going through my things," he said, as though that were the violation in the room. "I've been going through our things," I said. "There's a difference, and it's the difference this folder is going to cost you. Everything in that hillock came out of equity we built together. Everything in that storage unit was purchased with money from a line of credit secured against a house with both our names on the deed. You didn't just plan a life with Brooke Sinclair, Daniel. You planned to fund it with mine. It's not what you think," he said, the same line he'd used in the kitchen 6 months earlier, and I found, oddly, that I felt almost nothing hearing it a second time. No fresh wound, just the flat recognition of a man repeating himself because he had nothing new left to say. "I don't think anything," I told him. "I don't have to. I have dates." He reached for his own folder then, the thin one, as if the sheer act of holding paper might restore some balance between us, and I watched something in his face give way. Not remorse, I don't think, but the particular exhaustion of a man realizing the version of events he'd rehearsed for weeks had just been rendered irrelevant. "What do you want?" he said finally. "Just tell me what you want, Margaret." "I want the house," I said. "I want the equity you moved out of it restored, and I want everything in that storage unit back, starting with my mother's paintings. And I want you to understand that I am not asking you for any of it. I'm telling you what an attorney is, going to tell you tomorrow, once I hand him this folder, whether you agree to it tonight or not." Daniel did not raise his voice. I think by that point, some part of him had already understood the outcome the moment he saw my folder next to his. He sat very still for almost a full minute, and then he asked the only question that seemed to matter to him in that moment. How long I had known. "Since the driveway," I told him. "I've known since the driveway. I will not pretend the months that followed were easy, because grief does not observe a schedule, and neither does the slow, grinding machinery of divorce law. But I want to tell you what having that folder meant, because I think it's the part of this story other women need most. I did not go into our separation as a wounded, blindsided wife hoping her husband's attorney might show her mercy. I went in as a woman with a documented, dated, notarized record of exactly how much marital equity had been diverted, when, and to whom. A record so thorough that Daniel's own attorney, a sharp, exhausted-looking man named Philip Okafor, quietly advised him within 3 weeks to settle rather than litigate, because litigating would put every transfer, every falsified consulting invoice, and every dollar of that dealership buy-in on the public record, in a county where Daniel still had to run a business. The house became mine outright, not because a judge felt sorry for me, but because the paper trail I'd built showed $41,000 in equity improperly diverted from marital assets, and giving me full title to a home we'd bought together for $190,000 22 years earlier, was, by any accounting, the cheapest way for Daniel to make that number disappear. I recovered the silver, the paintings, and the contents of the fire safe, which turned out to hold nothing more sinister than old savings bonds, and a set of my mother's letters Daniel apparently hadn't bothered to read closely enough to realize were worthless to anyone but me. Brooke Sinclair, I later heard through the particular grapevine that exists in a town the size of ours, did not marry Daniel after all. Her father, upon learning the full shape of what his service manager had done to secure that buy-in, quietly ended both the relationship on the dealership floor and, not long after, the one at home. I still work as a title examiner. I still sit in a small office outside Macon, tracing other people's chains of ownership, hunting for the missing signature, the undisclosed lien, the quiet decision someone made without telling the person standing next to them. I understand that work differently now than I did before the summer my sister died. I used to think I was protecting buyers and sellers from bad paperwork. I understand now that what I was really doing, all those years, every single file, was learning how to protect myself, how to notice the thing that isn't there, how to gather what's true before someone else gets to decide what story survives. People ask me sometimes why I didn't scream in that driveway. I tell them the truth. I had already used up every scream I had at a graveside 3 hours earlier for a person who actually deserved my grief. What was left over, I decided. Standing in front of my own house in my funeral clothes, I was going to spend more carefully than that. Not on him, on the proof. 6 months later, when he needed me to sign something, I had already written the only version of that story that was ever going to hold up. And this time, for the first time in 26 years, it was written entirely in my own hand. Some evenings now, I sit on the back porch of the house on Cardigan Lane, under the pecan tree Daniel and I planted the second spring we lived there, and I think about the woman who stood in that driveway in her funeral clothes, watching a stranger's car she didn't recognize, deciding not to scream. I don't know that I would tell her to do anything differently, even now. Grief has a way of teaching you what you're actually capable of, if you let it. And mine taught me that the quietest response to betrayal isn't always weakness dressed up as composure. Sometimes it's the only form strength is willing to take that day. I buried my sister in July. I buried the marriage I thought I had somewhere in the months that followed, a little at a time, in bank statements and property records instead of a single dramatic scene. But I kept the house. I kept my name on the deed, and I learned in the process that I had spent 22 years building a skill I never once imagined I would need to use on my own life. The simple, patient, unglamorous discipline of noticing the thing that isn't there and refusing to look away from it until it is. If Margaret's story moved you, you are not alone, and you are not the only one who has had to be strong on the worst day of your life. If you believe the quiet ones are often the strongest ones, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this channel feels like a place where your story is understood, hit subscribe, because there is another woman's second bloom waiting for you right after this one.